walking all the day, near tall towers where falcons build their nest. Silver wing they fly, none call of freedom in their breasts. Some black hat against the sky, with twisted rock runs down to the street. Living on your western shore, saw some sunsets, asked for more. Stood by your Atlantic sea and sang a song for
Epic by Patrick Kavanagh. I have lived in important places, times when great events were decided. Who owned that half a rood of rock, a no man's land surrounded by our pitchfork-armed claims. I heard the Duffies shouting, "Damn your soul!" And old McCabe, stripped to the waist, seen stepped the plot defying blue cast steel. Here is the march along these iron stones. That was the year of the Munich bother. Which was more important? I inclined to lose my faith in Ballyrush and Gorchin, till Homer's ghost came whisper into my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance.
Misha Era, I Am Ireland. I am Ireland. I am older than the old woman of Barra. Great my glory, I who have borne Cuchulainn, the brave. Great my shame, my own children who sold their mother. Great my pain, my irreconcilable enemy who harasses me continually. Great my sorrow, that crowd in whom I placed my trust died. I am Ireland. I am lonelier than the old woman of Barra. Padraig Pearse. Trochnonama, good afternoon. My name is Sean Duffy, and if you came here to hear about 450 million years of Irish history, you're in the right place. I am your host. This program is called A History of Ireland and Song and Poetry, as you can clearly see. And we planned to do this last St. Patrick's Day, 2020, but of course, a pandemic got in the way, which is fairly typical for Irish history. But we're back. We are also resilient, which is typically Irish. And we're here to bring you the program. We're delighted to do so, but in a form that it was not intended to be in. We hope you enjoy it anyway. And please remember that this is our interpretation of Irish history as Irish Americans. And so we apologize in advance for any errors or oversimplifications, which are inevitable when you're dealing with this kind of a complex subject with so many variables. This is not meant to be academic. Please don't rely on it that way. This is storytelling, an ancient Irish tradition. And in the end, the poetry of history is subject to our own interpretation. It speaks to each of us differently. So let's get started without further eloquence. Trionónama and Banachtina Fela Padraig Uriv. Happy Feast of St. Patrick. In the Iliad, Homer described Ireland as a land of fog and gloom. Beyond it, the sea of death, where hell begins. Well, that was a bit harsh. Perhaps you've heard of this one. For the great Gaels of Ireland are the men that God made mad, for all their wars are merry, and all their songs are sad. Now, that was an Englishman named Chesterton. Still, not bad. But an Irishman said it best. Being Irish, he had an abiding sense of tragedy, which sustained him through temporary periods of joy. And that, of course, was William Butler Yeats, who helps us ensure on this day that no Englishman will have the last word. And as I mentioned, we will be exploring 450 million years in roughly an hour or less. So fasten your seatbelts. This Irish epic is really a story of invasion, assimilation, invasion, colonization, invasion, rebellion, invasion, oppression, starvation, and emigration. A more or less constant state of vociferousness. 450 million years ago, Ireland was divided north and south. Does that sound familiar? It should. But in this case, we're talking geologically. Northwest Ireland was connected to what is now North America. In fact, it was part of the Appalachian Trail, believe it or not. The southeast of Ireland was thousands of miles to the south. Through plate tectonic shifts over 10 millions of years, the two Irish plates collided, and 420 years ago, Ireland was united, perhaps for the last time since. The first humans to inhabit the island arrived 419,991,000 years later, in about 7,000 BC. So we are making rapid progress now. These were the Mesolithic Stone Age peoples. They built structures, passage tombs that were sophisticated, like Newgrange in County Meath at 5,200 years. It is older than Stonehenge, that little English structure, and older than the pyramids of Egypt. We know nothing more, virtually, about these people. And then, 3,000 years ago, during the Iron Age, the Celts arrived. We're far more familiar with them. They valued the spoken word, and bards were part of the aristocracy. So stories were passed on in the oral tradition, storytelling rather than writing. In those stories, the gods, the Tuatha De Danann, were driven underground by the Milesian Gael Celts who invaded from Spain. The Tuatha became the fairies that we know today as the leprechauns, banshees, pukas, the magic people. One of the earliest of the great epic stories is the Fenian Cycle, about the great warrior Finn McCool, who, as a boy, ate from the salmon of knowledge and gained all the knowledge and wisdom of the world through his thumb. He went on to command the Fianna, a fierce elite group of warriors. This poem, The Hosts of Faery, describes what they may have looked like.
The hosts of Faery. White shields they carry in their hands, with emblems of pale silver, with glittering blue swords, with mighty stout horns. In well-devised battle array, ahead of their fair chieftain, they march amid blue spears, pale-visaged, curly-headed bands. They scatter the battalions of the foe. They ravage every land they attack. Splendidly they march to combat, a swift, distinguished, avenging host. No wonder, though their strength be great. Sons of queens and kings are one and all. On their heads are beautiful gold and yellow manes, with smooth, comely bodies, with bright blue-starred eyes, with pure crystal teeth, with thin red lips. Good they are at manslaying, melodious in the alehouse, masterly at making songs, skilled at playing fiddle.
Another epic is called the Ulster Cycle, and it's part of that is the cattle raid of Cooley. In farming culture, cattle equaled wealth. This is the story of Cuchulainn. You may have heard of him, the Hound of Ulster, the Hercules of Ireland. The warriors of Ulster being cursed, the champion Cuchulainn of Ulster alone fought the warriors of Connacht under the great Queen Maeve. The invincible Cuchulainn was slain. St. Patrick. After a dogged fight, Rome conquered Britain. In the mid-1st century, whether out of weariness or fear of the Celt, Rome never conquered Ireland. But the Celts loved to raid Ireland, Rome and Britain, and she was target-rich island for Irish pirates and plunderers. A Roman Briton named Palladius Patricius was abducted by Irish raiders and spent 6 years a slave in Ireland. He escaped, studied for the priesthood, and went back to Ireland to convert the pagans as Patrick in 431 CE. This prayer, his prayer, is called St. Patrick's breastplate. An excerpt from St. Patrick's breastplate. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. A monastic system emerged among the hundreds of Tuatha or petty kingdoms. These monasteries became centers of scholarship and learning, like Glendalough in County Wicklow, Skellig Michael in County Kerry, Clonmacnoise in County Offaly. The abbot Columkill, known as Saint Columba, took the Irish brand of Christianity to the Scots, the Saxons, and then continental Europe with the collapse of Rome, and this is why the Irish are known to have saved civilization. The Vikings reached Britain around 793 and Ireland shortly thereafter in 795. The Norse raided the coasts while the Danes went inland. Dublin was established as a Viking town, followed by Cork, Wexford, and Waterford. The Vikings never actually conquered Ireland. Per se, they did establish outposts, which became towns, which is a new phenomenon for the Irish. In 978, a man named Brian Boru became king of Munster. In 1001, Brian Boru defeated a Viking Gaelic-Celt alliance. He became the first and last true Ardrí High King of Ireland, with all of the island united under his rule, a kingdom of warlords with him. On Good Friday, 1014, at the Battle of Clontarf, Brian won the battle. He was quite elderly at the time, but was killed, still ferocious. For their part, the first wave of Viking invaders were never really defeated by the sword, but they were thoroughly assimilated, unlike the English. Like the Celts, they became Irish. This is why many people of Irish descent to this day typically have Scandinavian or Viking DNA, and that's not uncommon to see. This song is called Brian Boru's March. Here's Fair May. Now, the second wave of Vikings would change everything. This is where it gets really complicated, so stay with me. We're going to go fast. But in 1169, the Normans, who were Viking French who conquered England in 1066, under this guy, Richard de Clare, better known as in infamy as Strongbow, entered the Irish story thanks to a wannabe king, Gaelic king of Leinster, known as Dermot MacMurchada, whose ambition was to be a high king of Ireland like Boru. So during a battle with another king, he made a deal with the Norman King Henry of England, Henry II, offering Dermot's daughter, Aoife, as a reward. So what happened was that Dermot, an Irishman, invited the English into Ireland for selfish reasons, and they've never left. So this was the commencement of what you may hear Irish people refer to as the 800 long years. And it was the Anglo-Norman Conquest of Ireland, and it was all by invitation. Then, of course, in 1517, Martin Luther's Reformation fractured Christianity, and this guy, Henry VIII, broke with Rome so that he could get a divorce and marry someone else. The Church of England and the Church of Ireland were born. Things would never be the same. Henry made himself king of Ireland and required the Irish lords to submit. Not a popular idea. His daughter, Elizabeth, succeeded him after Edward VI, and Protestantism was assured in the rule over Ireland. Meanwhile, born in 1530, This woman, Grace O'Malley, was the pirate queen of Ireland. She commanded 3 ships. Her biographer called her a genuine inheritor of the mother goddess and warrior queen attributes of her ancestors. In 1593, she went to London to meet with Queen Elizabeth and refused to bow to the Queen because she did not recognize her as the Queen of Ireland. So that's the type of person Grace O'Malley was, and she lived to tell about it. Meanwhile, the English, to break the Gaelic Ulster once and for all, started a process known as plantation, in which Gaelic Irish lands were taken away from their owners and given to Scots-Irish, Lowland Scots. This was the beginning of the troubles in Ulster, really. And plantation caused a great deal of anger among the Gaels, and an uprising in 1641 resulted in a massacre of Protestants that would not be forgotten. When the English Civil War occurred, that is, when Parliament went to war against the king, Catholic King Charles, Parliament won, Charles was executed, and Parliament sent this man, Oliver Cromwell, one of the most despised figures in Irish history, to Ireland to exact revenge for the 1641 massacre in Ulster. Cromwell laid siege. He massacred men, women, and children at Drogheda, and then he died. In 1660, there was a new Catholic king. The throne was restored, and the Protestants feared that the Catholics would take over for good. So they staged a coup called the Glorious Revolution, in which they placed this man, William of Orange, as the king. And the Catholic James was sent into exile. His Jacobite army came back to Ireland and laid siege to Derry. The Derry Protestants held out, no surrender. And on July 1, 1690, at the River Boyne, the Battle of the Boyne occurred, arguably the most significant event, certainly in Northern Irish history. And the Protestant William of Orange defeated the Catholic forces of James II, who was then sent into exile. The Orangemen of Northern Ireland have never let the Catholics forget it, marching every July in commemoration in Catholic neighborhoods. This is called Marching Season. This is the completion of the English conquest of Ireland. They instituted the penal laws, which took away rights from Catholics, notably the right to own land, to practice law, to hold office, and to own weapons. And their language was not taught in English schools, which gave rise to, as you may imagine, rebels. And one of the first was inspired by the French Revolution. A man named Theobald Wolfe Tone founded the United Irishmen. He was a Protestant. The United Irishmen were both Protestant and Catholic. They all despised English rule. Staged a rising in 1798. And the Irish, unfortunately, were armed only with pikes, facing cannon and gun, and they were badly routed. A ballad writer, years later, a Fenian poet, wrote this song you're about to hear called The Rising of the Moon, reflecting on the pikemen. Here are Michelle Duffy and Fairmay. Requiem for the Croppies by Seamus Heaney. The pockets of our greatcoats full of barley. No kitchens on the run. No striking camp. We moved quick and sudden in our own country. The priest lay behind ditches with the tramp. A people hardly marching on the hike. We found new tactics happening each day. We'd cut through reins and rider with the pike and stampede cattle into infantry. Then retreat through hedges where cavalry must be thrown until, on Vinegar Hill, the final conclave. Terraced thousands died, shaking scythes at cannon. The hillside blushed, soaked in our broken wave. They buried us without shroud or coffin. And in August, the barley grew up out of our grave. The United Irishmen intended a non-sectarian republic. What they got instead was a union of kingdoms of Britain and Ireland. The Act of Union of 1801 created the United Kingdom and the Union Jack. Catholics then found a nationalist leader in Daniel O'Connell, known as the Liberator. O'Connell was a lawyer opposed to violence who pushed for legal Catholic emancipation. During this period, Ireland experienced massive population growth to 8 million people by 1841. It's only 5 million today. But most of the Irish people came to rely on one crop for their sustenance, and this was to have devastating consequences. By the mid-19th century, the tenant farmers and working poor of Ireland had become dependent on the potato crop for survival. Starting in 1845, an insidious blight resulted in crop failure after crop failure, and people starved. All of Ireland was still under British rule at the time, but the British government adopted a hands-off policy, citing the free market. During the ensuing Great Hunger, more than 1 million people died of disease or starved to death, even as food grown in Ireland was shipped out. Instead of being used to feed people of Ireland who were starving, unable to pay rent, tenant farmers and their families were evicted from their homes. More than 2 million people left Ireland, most crossing the Atlantic in so-called coffin ships. The song that you are about to hear is attributed to Patrick Carpenter, a poet and native of Skibbereen in County Cork. Here are Michelle and Fairmay.
Oh, Father dear, I ofttimes hear you speak of Erin's eye. Her valleys green, her lofty scenes, her mountains rude and wild. They say it is a pretty place wherein a prince might dwell. Oh, why did you abandon it? Your reason to me tell. Oh, son, I love my native land with energy and pride, till a blight came over all my crops, my sheep and cattle died. The rent and taxes were so high I could not them redeem, and that's the cruel reason why I left old Skibbereen. 'Tis well, I do remember that bleak December day. The landlord and the sheriff came to drive us all away. He set my roof on fire with their demon yellow spleen. And that's another reason why I left old Skibbereen. Your mother too, God rest her soul, fell on the snowy ground. She fainted in her anguish, seeing the desolation round. She never rose but passed away from life to immortal dream. She found a quiet grave, my boy, in dear old Skibbereen. And you were only 2 years old, and feeble was your frame. I could not leave you with your friends, you bore your father's name. I wrapped you in my coat and more in the dead of night unseen. I heaved a sigh and said goodbye to dear old Skibbereen.
Famine, a Sequence by Desmond Egan. The stink of famine hangs in the bushes still, in the sad Celtic hedges. You can catch it down the line of our landscape. Get its taste on every meal. Listen, there is famine in our music. Famine behind our faces. It is only a field away. Has made us all immigrants. Guilty for having survived. Has separated us from language. Cut us off from our culture. Built blocks around belief. Left us on our own. Ashamed to be seen. Walking out beauty so honored by our ancestors, but fostered now to peasants, the drivers of motorway diggers, unearthing bones by accident under the disappearing hills.
Quarantine by Yvonnie Boland. In the worst hour of the worst season of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking, they were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her, put her on his back. He walked like that west and north until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847, also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and a woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved.
A group called Young Ireland staged a revolution in 1848 inspired by the European revolutions. It failed, as most Irish revolutions did, and many of its leaders were imprisoned in exile. One of those was a man named Thomas Francis Maher, who invented the Irish tricolor that you see here, modeled after the French flag. After escaping imprisonment in Australia, he escaped to the United States, where he became commander of the Irish Brigade in the American Civil War. Charles Stewart Parnell was a Protestant man who led the movement for the Land League to help the poor tenant farmers and home rule. The idea that Ireland would rule itself within the United Kingdom, all of his bills failed. So, lacking a peaceful response, the things changed utterly. And on Easter Monday, 24 April 1916, Irish rebels, both Catholic and Protestant, including poets, school teachers, actors, playwrights, professional revolutionaries, rose up against the British Empire. It was organized by intellectuals, poets. So it was called the Poets' Rebellion, and a blood sacrifice. It was more of a symbolic gesture. This time women were involved, like Countess Markovitz, who was from the aristocracy but was also a nationalist and a suffragette. And Cumann Ma, which was the women's version of the Irish Volunteers. Women like Winifred Carney actually fought in the Easter Rising. The rebels took various places in Dublin, such as the General Post Office, and then they declared a republic. And Patrick Pearse read this document on the steps of the GOP, and it's Poblach na Hern to the people of Ireland, the provisional government of the Irish Republic. Irish men and Irish women, we declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, to be sovereign and indefeasible. Fighting lasted only 6 days, and the rebels were soundly defeated by far superior forces. For her role, Countess Markovitz was imprisoned at Kilmainham jail. When her death sentence was commuted because she was a woman, she said, allegedly, "I do wish you had the decency to shoot me." Many of the men were shot, 16 of them executed, including James Connolly, who was too weak to stand and was shot in his chair. The events of the Easter Rising both broke hearts and inspired stories, as is reflected in this poem. Here is Patrick Cassidy.
Easter 1916, composed September 25th, 1916, by William Butler Yeats. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but where motley is worn, doth all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. The other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone through summer and winter seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim and a horse plashes within it. The log-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live. The stone is in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? Oh, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonough and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
By executing the leaders of 1916, the English made them martyrs. And this led to the Irish War of Independence. The Irish Republican Army essentially carried on a campaign of ambushes against the Ulster, the Royal Irish Constabulary. And the English, for their part, sent mercenaries called the Black and Tans, infamously brutal ex-World War I veterans, many times drunken and undisciplined, and committed atrocities. Michael Collins was the leader of the Irish Army. And by 1921, the war was a stalemate. Collins, as a negotiator, was blamed for the partition of Ireland, which meant that the 6 northern counties would remain a separate nation under the United Kingdom, while the southern 26 counties, became the Free State, but not a republic at this point, still subservient. So at this point, Eamon de Valera, the leader in the south, became enemies with Michael Collins, and the Irish Civil War followed. Collins was killed by a sniper's bullet. The North was divided, 2/3 Protestant and 1/3 Catholic, bitterly, historically irreconcilable. The majority party, the Ulster Unionists, Protestants created a state that served only their own constituents and interests, using gerrymandering to keep the Catholic vote subdued. In the South, de Valera's protectionism, both from trade and foreign ideas, left the Free State rather conservative and economically and socially repressed and subservient to the Catholic Church. In 1949, Dublin declared a republic, and after de Valera was gone, they enjoyed about a decade of liberalization and hope before the Troubles began, the modern Troubles. In 1968, a civil rights march in Derry was attacked by the RUC, and it was caught by television cameras this time, which changed everything. Fighting between Catholics and Protestants broke out in Derry and Belfast. The British Army was sent in, and this was the beginning of the modern Troubles. The Provisional IRA, fighting with paramilitary Protestant groups like the UDA and the UVF. And that's culminated in 1972, January 30th, another civil rights march. 14 unarmed protesters were shot dead by the British Army. This, of course, is known as Bloody Sunday and was a point of no return. It radicalized people and it caused reprisal after reprisal. And that's as much as detail as we're going to do about the Troubles, because in many ways this was the culmination of the historic themes we heard about today. And it's still an open wound for Ireland. It's not really appropriate for us, therefore, as Americans, to go further. But we will allow a remarkable song written by Dominic Behan, the younger brother of Brendan Behan, the playwright, to speak for us. Here is The Patriot Game with Michelle and Fairmay. 1990s, Ireland began to change and modernize. From 1995 to 2001, the Celtic Tiger made Ireland an economic powerhouse. Unemployment fell. People even began immigrating to Ireland from other places like Poland and Eastern Europe until the bubble burst. Meanwhile, the Belfast Agreement of 1998, also known as the Good Friday Agreement, led to power sharing and a break from paramilitary violence. Yet sectarianism, segregation, seen here the peace wall, so-called, paramilitary gangsterism continues in the neighborhoods. The Catholic, Protestant tension is still there. In 2005, the IRA decommissioned its arsenal, and in 2006, remarkably, the St. Andrews Agreement, Ian Paisley and Sinn Féin made a power-sharing agreement. The extremes, not the moderates, had negotiated uneasy power sharing. And Sinn Féin is now a major party in Ireland. If all of this can happen, can we ask the question, is there hope?
Company, and of all the harm that e'er I done, at last it was for none but me, and all I done for want of wit, to memory now I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all, and for all the comrades that e'er I had, they are sorry now for my going away, and of all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they would beg me one more day to stay. And since it falls into my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and I'll softly call, good night and